And now it's my privilege to introduce a young writer here in North Carolina, Logan Mayo-Laturi of Durham, 30 years old. Is a candidate for a master's degree in theological studies at Duke Divinity School. A veteran of the war in Iraq, he served in the U.S. Army, Sergeant E5, from August 2000 to November 2006. His book, titled Reborn on the 4th of July, The Challenge of Faith, Patriotism, and Conscience, is just recently published. Please welcome Logan Mayo-Laturi.
I'm aware that another book published in the 70s bears a title very similar to mine. But I often find myself kind of an odd bird at a lot of these gatherings because I'm very, very religious. And to describe what brought me here, I don't have any other words to use but to say that I came to Jesus. And I'm very aware of how superficial that can sound in our culture today, particularly in North Carolina with the recent Amendment 1 stuff. And so I can only ask that you forgive the church for that superficiality, but it's the only way I have of narrating my story, which I've done in this book. The only other thing I'll say before reading a very short excerpt is that part of what made my journey possible is an organization I helped form in 2008 for other Christian soldiers. We gave it the title Centurions Guild, and you can find out more. I've set up over in the corner over there, and I can talk to you about that. But I did want to make you aware that there's a small organization that's trying to equip fellow service members of faith with how do we deal critically and honestly with our identity as citizens and as service members. So the excerpt I'm going to read, I thought was it was probably the turning point for me during my deployment in 2004 with the 25th Infantry Division. I had previously been at Fort Bragg for 2 years as a paratrooper before I re-enlisted and went out to Hawaii. I deployed with the 25th in January 2004, came home in 2005, and I came to Jesus, and the Army showed me the door. But this short excerpt is, as I said, kind of the turning point for me. I described just prior about how my platoon is responding to a rescue operation. I think that's as much description as I need. This is the section in the first movement of my book. The subtitle of it is I Can't Save Everyone. Both the victims and perpetrators of combat lose people they love in war. The victims of war lose people close to them. People at home lose those they sent to combat, and those of us who see combat lose our fellow soldiers. But those who kill in combat also experience loss. Our loss is no less real than that of our victims. Many of us experience the very loss of ourselves. After searching the reservoir, I put my gear back on and began looking for other ways to help. I circled this overturned vehicle, digging out the cab for a while and occasionally helping the injured up the hill. I was in crisis mode, trying to fix things, everything. I hadn't even dried off. I was soaking wet in the midst of an Iraqi winter. I kept passing someone I thought was a rescuer near the rear of the truck. I didn't take any notice until the umpteenth time I passed him when I realized that his legs had never moved a single inch. I tapped his leg to get his attention. Nothing. I slipped my hand under his pant leg and felt for his skin. It was clammy, but I was sure I felt the pulse. I had found my next mission, the next thing I could save. I hailed a medic who shrugged, "He's too far gone. We need to focus on the men we can save." My heart dropped. In the real world, that place we had left when we boarded the plane for Kuwait, medical personnel treat the most severe cases first. Priority goes to those who most need medical attention. Everyone else can wait. But in combat, triage is reversed. The direst cases with the least chance of survival are assisted only in dying painlessly. Medical supplies are rationed for those who are less injured and more likely eventually to return to the fight. I have a stubborn spirit, and I wasn't about to give up on this falling soldier. While gawkers piled up around us, I dug around the man's body using tools when they were available, but continuing with my hands when they were not. The whole time I watched for his legs to twitch, to shift weight, anything to indicate he was stirring to life. I checked his pulse incessantly. Seconds turned to minutes, minutes turned to hours. Some joined me in my effort, but few stayed for long. Sometime around 3 a.m., a convoy from FOB Warrior in Kirkuk arrived with a crane and a team of Special Forces medics. Only a few of the rescuers remained at the bottom of the pit. I watched from the bluff as they hooked the crane to the upturned Humvee, as the Humvee creaked and groaned loudly until it was finally lifted from the leg of the sergeant that was pinned. He was now blithering much more loudly, paying no attention to the friend holding his hand as the wreckage scraped against his bare flesh, almost certainly causing more damage before the SF medics could go to work. Nobody seemed to notice the other young man slipping toward the ultimate price, or my effort to prevent that from occurring. Nobody held his hand, nobody coaxed him to courage as he persevered through the ordeal. His body lifted slightly as the crane pulled up on the vehicle and dropped softly when whatever he had been caught on was freed. It was not until that moment that one of the medics took notice and hovered over him to take his vitals. The medic's right hand went up, a sign that the casualty was not yet a fatality. As he was taken away, I caught a glimpse of his face. It was ghastly gray, but there was a thumbs up. He had a pulse. I could cling to that at least. My hope was dashed on the ride home. News came over the radio that the sergeant that was pinned would almost certainly face amputation and a ticket back to the real world. The young man I had tried to help had died on the way back to Kirkuk. Back at our FOB, we had to spend the evenings in blackout, which meant we could not use any lights in our military tents. Our platoon went to sleep in pitch black, but I couldn't find rest. My heart rate hadn't slowed since we got back. All I could think about was the dead black silence that surrounded that young man as he lay dying. The sun came up and we went to breakfast in the small mess tent. The cooks were showing Pearl Harbor on a television set in a corner by the chow line. We walked in right in the middle of the namesake scene as Japanese bombers strafed the airfield along East Lock. If I had something in my stomach to throw up, I would have. I sat in a trance as everyone else around me ate. All I could think about is how human beings could watch fake gore, fake violence. I had seen death up close, right in my face. I had enjoyed this movie before I deployed, but now it was insulting and disgusting to me. All I knew was gone. All I thought I appreciated about war had eroded. Over the next week, I continued to stare blankly into the pitch of night, unable to rest in peace in the crypt of our platoon tent. I wondered if the man could hear everyone around him. I wondered if he knew he was being ignored in favor of other, more viable casualties. Could he hear people clanging away at the vehicle, nowhere near where he was trapped? Could he hear my frantic clawing at the dirt around his legs? I hoped so. Maybe it would alleviate the survivor's guilt I was almost certain to encounter. I questioned God. I doubted. Why did this young man die? Was he serving some greater purpose? He wasn't cut down heroically by enemy fire. He didn't throw himself on a grenade or sacrifice himself as a decoy to draw fire. He was sitting in the back of a Humvee packed with too many people when a fatigued and disoriented driver missed a turn. It all seemed so excruciatingly meaningless. American culture taught me that death in combat was supposed to be honorable. It was supposed to tug our heartstrings and embolden us to fight on with a good and noble cause. Instead, my heart was clawed and dragged by nagging doubt and horrific memories. The worst was attending his memorial a day or two later. As we stood around the battle cross bearing his name, we heard the whistling of incoming rounds. They landed somewhere off target, nowhere near enough to cause us any real harm. Nonetheless, every single person wandered off aimlessly, without fully memorializing our fallen comrade. I looked over my shoulder as I followed the guys in my platoon off toward the horizon. I wondered if we were abandoning his memory as easily as we had his body to the dirt and the mud. Somewhere in there, something struck me. 11 months into my tour, I had seen a good number of bodies pile up. While I was on duty at a hospital in Samara, the morgue was filled past capacity. Bodies were left in black bags outside to swell and stink mercilessly in the desert heat. In fact, the number of bodies was greater than the amount of body bags the hospital had on hand. I was tasked with photographing them in case their faces became disfigured in the desert heat, making identification difficult. I photographed countless dead and dying Arab faces. Not one tear tumbled down my face. They were not like me. Their language, skin color, and customs were all different. What kept me from mourning the deaths of the Arab and predominantly Muslim people that I encountered? Was my heart that hardened? I thought I was a good man, fighting the good fight. I thought I was Chris Taylor in Platoon, always opposing the temptation to evil. I wasn't torturing or humiliating prisoners like the trigger-happy sadists I'd read about on the news. But when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw something different from before. My experience revealed something I could not have simply learned on my own. I was a product of a systemically unjust and sinful world. I had been formed by language and images and cultural markers that told me clearly who my enemy was. It only made it worse when I thought of how convinced I was I hadn't been so formed. Conscience literally means with knowledge. Knowledge is a one-way process. You can never unlearn the thing you come to know. Everything I thought I knew was coming under fire. Was I a good man? I thought I was. Everything changed in this pale light that death has cast on all I've done. My experience at Samara was like finding a membership card to the Ku Klux Klan in my wallet, with my own signature on it. I could not believe that I could be so callous, so immune to the cost of war. That week in November, my hardened heart broke in two. I saw just how deeply numb I was to the human suffering of the other that I saw every day in Iraq. I found that thin red line between sinner and saint is not always so easy to discern, that the violence in the world is directly correlative to the violence in each of us. One of my last memories in Iraq was in Mosul during the first open democratic elections in that country. My platoon was assigned to a safe house overlooking the polling site in the old section of the city where foot soldiers hadn't been yet. On election day, late in the afternoon, an insurgent threw a grenade toward our position. A young Iraqi soldier saved many of us from the brunt of the blast. The platoon opened fire, wounding the assailant considerably but failing to prevent his escape. I called in a medevac as our medic worked to stop the Iraqi soldier's bleeding. Kneeling in the alley, I watched his blood spilled by our attacker, mixed with the blood shed by our savior. Who was friend and who was foe? That thin red line that I had relied on to differentiate between sinner and saint pooled in the gutter at my feet. Is the line scrawled by a fine-tip marker or painted with a rolling brush? Thanks.